So the second study I want to talk about is a study we did in high school with kids, learning to argue and arguing to learn. Okay, so this was a type of study about genetically modified organisms in France, which is a big debate in France because they're very interested in their food, okay, and they don't want GMOs. And so we worked with argumentation graphs. You can see them on the right-hand side of the screen. And this was a distance type of situation where students worked silently, really exchanging chat messages and constructing these graphs about genetically modified organisms. So the kinds of theoretical assumptions I have here is that knowledge is co-constructed within interaction. Okay? It's dependent on the context. So is the teacher going to grade the students? That makes a difference in what they do. What kinds of tools are they using? And we're interested in the reasoning process, okay, as that shows up when we record what's happening. And the problem here, if we think about theory and practice, is that it's a kind of an experiment where we have two different conditions, and you'll see that. But it's not a real experiment because it's in the classroom. We call it an ecological experiment sometimes. It means that there are stakeholders. It means that the children are going to be graded, so they have a reason to be in the situation. They're not just paid or coming in after school. It's part of their school. They're graded. The teacher it's integrated within the curriculum. So all this makes a difference. It's not just some kind of experiment, okay? So we did have a pedagogical objective that was, we actually developed this with the French teacher, okay, in the school. But we also had a research and developmental objective. So we had these research questions that I'll tell you. But we were also interested in furthering the computer science development of this argumentation graph. So here the kinds of stuff we worked on were chat messages that the children wrote to each other. We also looked at what kinds of arguments they put into the graph. And we recorded all this automatically on the computer. And we were able to replay these interactions to look at them to see how they created the graphs. And we analyzed the graphs, I'll show you that, with this method called ADAM, Argumentation Diagram Analysis Method. And we again did these kinds of interaction analyses. So we didn't focus just on the process this time. Okay, we wanted to look at the graphs that the students did beforehand, before, during, and after debate. And I'll explain the pedagogical scenario to you after this slide. And we had two different conditions, okay, and we wanted to know which of the conditions was better so that the children explored and deepened their understanding of the debate. So they weren't trying to win. It wasn't a kind of situation where they had to win the debate. Okay, it was more like they had to work together to understand in the discussion about genetically modified organisms, what are the topics that you have to talk about? There's agriculture, there's ethical arguments, there's health. There are different kinds, and there are different social actors. There's maybe Greenpeace, Monsanto, the seed company. There's the ministry that gives the rules in the government. There are all kinds of, so we wanted them to explore the topic. We didn't want them to compete to win, okay? So again, we gave them instructions, and we looked at their individual graphs after the debate in these two different conditions that I'll show you. And we were in the high school, okay? So here now it's kind of complicated, but there were three different main phases, okay? The first phase were where the students did an individual graph. They researched information about genetically modified organisms, and then they drew a graph. Now a graph, I haven't really told you what that is, but there's a thesis. You say, genetically modified organisms should be banned. They should not be authorized. Okay, that's your thesis. You either argue for or against that, okay? And you give arguments for or against it by, you can see that there's a plus, there's a box. If the top box was your thesis, this would be an argument for your thesis because there's a plus sign. If there was a minus sign, I don't have any minus signs on this slide, it would be an argument against your thesis. Like say, world famine would be solved. That might be an argument against banning genetically modified organisms. But an argument for banning them would say, well, that increases pollution. Okay? So once the students had researched about genetically modified organisms and they had done their individual graphs, then they came together in pairs in one of two different conditions. Okay, the first condition, they used the graph for debating. They just right away started doing a graph together. Okay, and they used the chat how they wanted to. Really just talking or however they wanted to. We didn't explain how they should. And in this condition, they first debated in the chat and they didn't have the graph. And then at the end, they took their chat debate and they transformed it into the graph. So they had to reread what they said and they had to put it into a picture form, okay? So that involved changing representations, right? So what did we look at, depending on the condition? We wanted to check what the differences were in the graphs in the beginning and in the graphs in the end, in both conditions. Okay, also what were the modifications, what type of modifications were made. And then we wanted to do some kind of taxonomy of graphs. To look at how could we describe the graphs also. Okay, and then we wanted to also look at the individual contributions in the collaborative part, okay? Can we see what's individual and what's collaborative? And then finally, during the debate part, what happens in the middle here, in phase 2, we wanted to see, well, how do students negotiate meaning? Can we find other patterns or regularities? Okay, in terms of co-construction, how are they working together? How are they creating knowledge? Okay? Now this is what we found in this condition 1 in terms of what happened in the debate. When you have to coordinate between a chat and a graph, because you're actually doing both of them at the same time, you you have more opinions in the graph. Because what you can also do in these graphs is that you have your theses, you have your arguments for and against, but then you also mark your opinions. Now that's sometimes difficult for students because they can't see the difference, but it means you have an argument, say you say, famine will end, famine will be ended. Okay, that's your statement. And that's an argument in favor of, I'm trying to get this right, against not banning genetically modified organisms. And you can either be in favor or not in favor of that argument. You either agree with it or you don't agree with it. Okay, so you can mark your opinion on these graphs as well. And students marked more opinions on their graph when they were in this condition 1. And we think that it's because there was a lot of confrontation going between them. They were talking, they had to construct the graph, they were in action, and so they wrote opinions. We didn't find that here, and the reason why we think we didn't find that here is because they first did the chat, and then they constructed the graph, so it was more like they were already, they were constructing a kind of unique voice, a group voice. Okay, so they didn't put opinions on, individual opinions on the graph. So this is important for pedagogical, has pedagogical consequences in the classroom when you're working with students. Do you want them to do their own opinions or do you want them to have a group opinion?